This week, we're going to talk about how to compress your vocals and a very simple and straightforward approach to do so. Before we get to that, who am I? My name is Tyson Borman. I am from DinosaurDogStudio.com. And if you want to check out my website or my portfolio, you can just go over to DinosaurDogStudio.com and check that out to make sure that I'm actually legitimate in what I'm telling you. If you don't like the sound of my vocals on my portfolio on that website, then you probably shouldn't listen to this video. That being said, if you are interested in working with me in any aspect or capacity, then I always will give a free test mix or master if you are interested in working with me for any new clients. So go ahead and go to my website to learn more about that. With that said, we are talking about compressing vocals today. If you didn't watch the video last week, go back and watch that first, because you have to prep your vocals before you start compressing them and essentially gain staging every single word before you actually dive into the compression. With that said, let's dive into my approach to compressing vocals. Last week, if you remember, we prepped this vocal track for compression. So today we're actually going to go over how to compress this vocal properly in order to get a punchy, thick, and also consistent vocal sound for our song. So this vocal actually belongs in a rock song. So we do want that kind of aggressive, punchy vocal sound, but we also want it to be extremely consistent so that amongst all of the heavy guitars and the drums, we can still hear every single word that the vocalist is singing. So that is our goal with our compression. And I'll give you an example of what the song actually sounds like at the very end of this video, so you have the context of where this vocal is actually living. But just for the sake of showing you exactly what we're doing, it's going to be much easier to just hear the vocal in solo. And so now what we're going to do is throw on our first compressor. So in my compression chain, I'm going to have 3 different compressors. The first compressor is going to be a normalizing type compression. The second compression is going to be a punchy type compression to bring the vocal forward and give it a little bit more of aggressiveness. And then the last compressor is going to be a thickness type compressor to make the vocal really thick and very, very consistent. So you'll be able to hear every single tail of this vocal part and every single syllable that he is singing. In terms of an analogy to help you remember how to do this is, I like to think of construction, because I did work construction for a while, and actually how to pound in a nail into a block of wood when you're trying to build a wall or whatever you're trying to build. So a really good carpenter can use 3 hits to get a nail into a piece of wood or for whatever you're building. So the first hit is just to set the nail. So just to get it inside of the wood, so then you can really take a good swing at it. The second hit is to really get it almost all the way into the wood. You can really hit it really hard because it's already set. It's not going to move after you've set it with the first hit. And then the third hit is actually just to make that nail flush with the wood, so that when you run your hand over it, you're not going to actually hit the nail, and you can build on top of that if needed. So that's kind of the analogy that I'm going to use. Hopefully it helps you remember how to actually compress your vocals. But the first step is to set the nail or normalize your track so that it's going to be ultra consistent before we start pounding it with the punchy type compression. We're just going to add a factory digital compressor here. I'm going to use this compressor for all of the different types of compression. This is going to kind of prove that you don't necessarily need super fancy equipment to get a good vocal mix or vocal compression. You can use just a digital compressor, even though they have, I have options to use more analog type compression. I'm not going to, just for the sake of argument that you really don't need it. How to get normalizing type compression is going to be a fast attack and a slow release. The goal of this is to capture the transients and the tails of all of the notes consistently, so that it's bringing everything down for when it peaks above the threshold. The goal is to just have a very, very consistent vocal take without adjusting the balance between the transients and the tails of each note. How to set up our compressor first is we're going to move the ratio all the way up, the knee to 0, our ratio as high as it will go, and attack and release as fast as it will go. The point of this, setting up our compressor like this, is to
find where those peaks are actually happening so we can grab onto just the loudest peaks and then make those a little bit more level.
'Cause who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby, would that work for you and me? Who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby, would that work for you and me? 'Cause who am I if you're rather uncertain?
Okay, so that looks pretty good to me. As you can tell, the needle is just punching in right during those loud notes and then coming straight back to 0. That's really what we want. If our needle is not coming all the way back to 0, where it's not compressing, that means that we've captured a lot of the valleys inside of the compression. We want it to just hit it really fast and then come straight back. That means we're only capturing the transients. So I might actually back this up just a little bit more. And then what we're going to do is adjust our attack and release settings. So again, the goal is to capture the entire note. So we're going to have a relatively faster attack to capture the transient, but not make it sound unnatural. And then also a slower release, so it's capturing the tail of the note, not just the transient that exceeds the threshold.
'Cause who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby, would that work for you and me? Who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby, would that work for you and me? 'Cause who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby, would that work for you and me? Who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, rather uncertain.
Okay, so this is really what I'm after. Is you can tell right between those syllables and those words are the needles coming right back to 0 and then hitting the next note, because all of them are exceeding the threshold. But what we want is to compress the entire note as much as possible so that it's very consistent. So that's a really good example of what we're really going for, is right here.
Who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby, would that work?
So as you can tell, it's coming back to 0 multiple times during the measure, but it's still capturing all those transients that's exceeding the threshold. So our last step is to, while this is still pretty obvious and still kind of in your face in terms of how much you can tell that it's compressing, we're going to adjust the ratio because the ratio is really high still. So I'm going to bring this back to 0, or 1 to 1, and then I'm going to slowly bring it up until we're getting about 2 to 3 decibels of gain reduction. Because again, this point is not to be in. The point of this compression is not to be obvious. It is meant to be consistent and evening out the vocal before our next stylistic type compression. So if we're hearing this obviously, it's probably not a great idea.
'Cause who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby, would that work for you and me? Who am I if you're rather uncertain? 'Cause who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby, would that work for you and me? Who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby.
Okay, so as you can tell, it's just hitting around minus 3 decibels of gain reduction during those loudest peaks. And so that's looking pretty good to me. Most of the time it's hitting around 1.5 decibels of gain reduction. And the last step is to actually gain stage this. So what we're going to do is grab our level meter. We're going to do our peak volume, because we're just trying to make this consistent. We're going to grab the peaks. You could use the average volume for this too. It's not super critical, but just to make sure we're not making our vocal too loud or too soft comparatively to before the compression took place.
'Cause who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby, would that work for you and me?
So it looks like it's mostly sitting right below -12. So let's see without.
'Cause who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby.
Yeah, so it's a little bit quiet. So let's move it up about probably 1.5.
'Cause who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe?
The point is to have a consistent gain before versus after so that we're not tempted to think that we did a really good job with our compression just because it's louder. So it's a common mistake that you'll make when you're EQing, compressing anything. Just because it's louder, it's going to sound a little bit better to you, which is kind of a way that you could fake yourself out when you're mixing. So now that we have this vocal a little bit more consistent and level with our first compression, our second compression is actually going to be a punchy type compression. A punchy type compression is going to be a slower attack and a slower release. The point of this type of compression is to emphasize the transients, so it's going to bring the vocal a little bit closer to us. It's going to kind of sound like he's spitting the words out of his mouth a little bit more, and just make it a little bit more aggressive. So with the style of music that this vocal part goes to, it's a really good move to try to make it punchy. Another reason to do this is to make the vocal sound closer to you. The more emphasis you create between the transients and the tails of each note, it's going to appear that the vocal is actually closer to you if those are more and more dynamic. So this is actually adding more dynamics into the vocal take rather than taking away dynamics like we were doing with the last compressor. But because we took dynamics away with the last compressor, we can be a little bit more controlled in how we're impacting each and every note with our punchy type compression here. My first step is to just capture what those peaks are. And so I've set my compressor up the same exact way as I did the first time with a very high ratio, very fast attack, fast release, and a 0 threshold. And then we're going to move it down until we can capture just the peaks.
'Cause who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby, would that work for you and me? Who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby, would that work for you and me? 'Cause who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby, would that work for you and me?
So that's looking pretty good to me. Just capturing those peaks. So the point of this is to allow the transients to actually pass through the compression or not be compressed and then attack the actual tail of the note. So to do that, we want a longer attack. So it's going to wait longer before it compresses. So it's going to allow the transient to pass through. And then we're going to have a longer release to then capture the entire tail. So let's start adjusting our attack and release settings. We really want to be able to hear when it feels like he's starting to spit the words out of his mouth. That's really what we're after here. But we don't want to go too long where we're actually going into the tail of the note and not compressing that. Again, we're trying to emphasize those transients, which is the impact of the notes.
'Cause who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby, would that work for you and me? Who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby, would that work for you and me? 'Cause who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby, would that work for you and me? Who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby, would that work for you and me? 'Cause who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby, would that work for you and me? Who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to...
So as you can tell, if I'm at 0 milliseconds on the attack, it sounds like he's almost singing in the back of his throat rather than spitting the words out and being really aggressive with them. So just listen to that for a second.
'Cause who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you...
And then compare to around 100 milliseconds where you can really hear him spitting those words out.
'Cause who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby, would that work for you and me? Who am I if you're rather uncertain?
So that's really what we're after. So that's sounding pretty good to me, right around 90 milliseconds. And then the release I have set at around 260 milliseconds. It's actually kind of convenient too, because 260 milliseconds is about a quarter note with the time signature that we have, to where we're getting the appropriate amount of gain reduction. Again, we're going to be targeting around minus 3 decibels of gain reduction.
'Cause who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby, would that work for you and me? Who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby, would that work for you and me? 'Cause who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby, would that work for you and me? Who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby, would that work for you and me? 'Cause who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby, would that work for you and me?
So that's looking pretty good to me. Sounded pretty good too. And the next stage is finishing our nail off. So we've already set our nail with our normalizing type compression. We've really punched our nail in with our punchy type compression. And the next stage is going to be finishing the nail off with some thickness type compression. So this is going to make the vocal ultra consistent. And also we're going to be a lot more aggressive with this compressor than we were with our other compressors. The reason is because we want to capture every single thing inside the vocal take and essentially make it louder. The point of this is to thicken up the vocals and literally make the tails of the vocal thicker. This is going to make the vocal louder and also ultra consistent, so you can hear every single syllable throughout the entire song. And also it's just going to make the vocal have a more thick quality, especially for heavier music. You want that vocal to really stand its own against all of these other really thick guitars and drums that are going to be inside the mix. So it kind of kills the vibe when you have a really thin sounding vocal. So this is actually going to be able to show you how to get a really thick vocal, even if you only have one vocal take. So I generally have more than one vocal. I have 1 to 3 doubles of the lead vocal that I use to make the vocal sound thicker. But this is another technique that I either use along with that, or if I don't have doubles, then I'll just use this alone just to make that vocal sound a little bit thicker and take up more space inside of the mix, make it ultra consistent, and ultimately end up with a heavier sounding vocal. So with that in mind, we're going to dive into how to set up our thickness type compression. This is going to be a very fast attack and also a fast release, but we're going to get a lot of gain reduction out of this. The whole point of this is to, again, capture every single thing inside of the vocal and then kind of bring up the floor of that vocal. So it's going to make it sound thick. So we're going to set up our vocal, or setting up our compressor. This same as we did originally, capture all those peaks, find out where there are, and then we're going to keep going into the valleys until we get about 10 decibels of gain reduction. So it's going to sound really bad initially, but you'll kind of see where I'm going with this in a minute.
'Cause who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby, would that work for you and me? Who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to...
Okay, so, and then I'm going to adjust my attack and release. Again, we're going to go for a fast attack and fast release on this type of compression.
'Cause who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby, would that work for you and me? Who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby, would that work for you and me? 'Cause who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby, would that work for you and me? Who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe?
Okay, and then we're going to set our ratio. Our ratio is probably going to be pretty high on this still because we want to get a lot of gain reduction out of this.
'Cause who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby, would that work for you and me? Who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby, would that work for you and me? 'Cause who am I if you're...
Yeah, so that's really what I'm looking for, is between -5 and -10 decibels of gain reduction. That way we can be sure we're capturing all the sound inside of this vocal. Right now it sounds pretty bad. We're slamming this really hard, and that's intentional. So what we're going to do is actually bring this mix knob all the way down. So this is the mix between the dry of the punchy type compression coming into this, and then the actual thickness type compression. So I'm just going to bring this mix knob up until it sounds like the vocal's being thickened up, but it's not losing its punchiness from the prior compression that we did.
'Cause who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby, would that work for you and me? Who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby, would that work for you and me?
And yeah, I also just realized I didn't gain stage our last compression, so let's go ahead and do that really quick. And so because this is punchy type compression, because we're trying to emphasize those transients, we want the transients to be louder on the punchy type compression. I'm going to use a average volume to gain stage this. That way we can actually make the transients louder but have the valleys the same. So it's going to appear to be the same volume to our ears as humans.
'Cause who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe?
So it's around -28 decibels there.
'Cause who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room?
No, probably -26, so we need about 2 decibels of gain, makeup gain here.
'Cause who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby.
Okay, that's looking pretty good. So we're around -26. Let's see on our thickness type compression when it's all the way up.
'Cause who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby, would that work for you and me? Who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe?
So just even looking at this meter here, watch how little the volume changes when on the average volume for this. It's very, very consistent, which is the whole point of this thickness type compression.
Cause who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby.
Okay, anyway, now let's go back to actually mixing this in.
Cause who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby, without work for you and me. Who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby, without work for you and me. Cause who am I if you're rather uncertain?
Okay, so that's sounding pretty good to me. You can tell just how consistent that vocal really is in comparison to where it first started. So I'm going to do a quick before and after for you so you can hear every single stage together. So here's raw vocal before we did any compression.
Cause who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby, without work for you and me. Who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby, without work for you and me. Cause who am I if you're rather uncertain? And what if I just gave you a little room to breathe? Tell me, baby, without work for you and me.
So there you have it. That is how I approach vocal compression. So a couple notes before I quit here is the first thing is remember the 3 stages of compression. To set your nail, you're going to use normalizing type compression. To really punch your nail in, you're going to use punchy type compression. And then the last one is thickness type compression to really make that flush and be able to hear your vocal through the entire song. And also thicken it up so it creates more of a presence in the vocal comparatively to your other instruments. So the last thing I want to say is when you're using these different compressors, sometimes you'll find that if your vocal is already really thick, you may not need thickness type compression, or if your vocal is already really punchy, you may not need punchy type compression. This is just a generalized approach. You should always listen to your own audio, see what your vocal actually needs. But I like this approach because I can go ahead and do this, and then I can take away one of the compressors, or I can mix it in a little bit less if I need less punch in the vocals, but still want some of that quality. So I can go in and just use this in parallel and start only mixing in about 50% of the punchy type compression so that it's actually taking in less gain reduction. It's using more of the natural vocal sound for more open performances. So with less instrumentation, you'll likely need to use less compression because your vocal doesn't need to be as consistent and still be intelligible and heard by the listener. There's a lot of nuance that goes on here, but I hope this is a helpful vocal compression approach for you to use in your own mixes. So with that said, thanks for watching, and I'll see you